Congressman Tom Cole, and this is another one of our weekly congressional chats. We're back actually in Washington, D.C. this week, but I want to start with something a little closer to home. Obviously, we had severe wind and some tornado damage in the 4th District this last week. That's always tragic. People get hurt, and we certainly had a number of injuries. Fortunately, no fatalities, but we lost some structures, had some damage, and again, much more importantly, had personal injuries. So anybody that happens to be listening to this that might have been impacted by that, first of all, please know you have our deepest sympathy. These things happen with some regularity in the state of Oklahoma. We've certainly had plenty of tornadoes over the years, but when it happens to you, it's personal and special, and it's traumatic. So again, you have our deepest sympathies. If our office can help you in any way, and everything from FEMA mitigation to request for assistance and support, please contact us. We're certainly working with the local agencies and trying to make sure the federal government does the things it's responsible for doing in these kind of disasters. And we've had good cooperation, we generally do, but we don't want anybody falling through the cracks. So please feel free to get in touch with us. We can be of any kind of assistance in any way. In terms of Congress, a number of things underway. A significant piece of legislation passed the House. It's called the Rein In Act. And basically, it's to mandate that when the executive branch issues executive orders that have an expense with them, that they also issue a report about the impact on inflation. The Biden administration has spent more money by executive orders, sort of circumventing Congress, than any other administration in American history. They've managed to do that in 2 years. So this is a significant contributor to inflation, and we simply want to try and make the administration accountable and, frankly, educate the American public that when these kind of actions are taken, again, outside of Congress and without thought about the amount of money being interjected into the economy when we're already running record deficits, then we want people to be aware of that. So it was actually bipartisan. We got a significant number of Democratic votes that also felt like, again, the executive branch is sort of going beyond Congress. So we appreciate that. It was something, while there was controversy about it, and the administration doesn't like it, we think it'll pass the Senate, and then honestly it'll be up to the president as to whether he signs it or not. He's threatened to veto it. No president likes to be held accountable, but frankly, every president, regardless of party, ought to be held accountable. And in this case, if it gets to his desk, it'll be because there was bipartisan support. It's a Democratic Senate. Obviously, we got Democratic votes in the House for this, so we're hopeful that at least this discussion will educate the American public about some of the ways in which we think the federal government wastes a lot of money and contributes to inflation. In terms of other legislative activities, we've spent a couple of months constituting the Congress, getting all the committees set up. Their regular hearings are starting now, and legislation's being considered. We had the appropriations process begin this week in earnest. I sit, of course, on defense appropriations. We had a really insightful hearing yesterday over the entire Ukrainian issue. There's certainly people that legitimately question the amount of money we're spending and the consequences of this particular set of expenditures, but important to note, everything that's been spent has been approved by Congress, usually on a bipartisan basis, particularly if it was a standalone bill. There's broad support for the Ukrainian people in Congress on both sides of the aisle. We can argue a lot about how we got here. I personally think the Biden administration contributed to that. President Biden was part of the administration, the Obama-Biden administration, that did nothing when the Russians seized Crimea, and then the Russians certainly watched as there was the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, and we turned over a country of 38 million people right back to the same folks that had given Osama bin Laden protection while he was planning 9/11 and executing it. I think Putin looked at that and said, that's the American attitude. They're not going to mind if I go into Ukraine. And so I think the administration bears some responsibility for that. Having said that, I will say I think the providing of support, robust support to Ukraine, has been the right decision, and the administration, the president, deserve credit for that. I had the privilege, as some of you know that listen to this broadcast or this availability, this chat on a regular basis, to visit with Ukrainian forces that were training down at Fort Sill in the Patriot batteries. That was a pretty moving experience. Every single soldier, Ukrainian soldier that I met, had lost either a fellow soldier in combat, friends, or family. In one case, one particular individual lost both his parents and his spouse to Russian military activity. This is a pretty brutal war. Over something like 200,000 Russian casualties. Our intelligence estimates 60 to 100,000 Russians dead. Of course, tens of thousands of Ukrainians as well. Compare that to Afghanistan, where we were at for 20 years, and it was certainly a tough, hard slog, but we only lost 2,400 soldiers in 20 years, and obviously we haven't had another 9/11 since we went on the offense against terrorism all the way back in 2001. That's been a good thing, and it's something that I think couldn't have been anticipated. The Ukrainians are in a big fight, and they're fighting to defend their homes, their family, their freedom, their culture. The Russians have been pretty brutal in this, and so I think you'll continue to see bipartisanship. There's some other areas where you see some bipartisanship. Last night, a brand new committee set up by the Republicans, the Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between China and the United States, had its first meeting. And I expect this effort to be bipartisan. We tried to persuade Speaker Pelosi to set up a committee like this. She refused to do it. But now that we've set it up, we think we're getting really good Democratic interest and participation. Every American knows that some of the things China's doing around the world, the almost genocide activity, if not actually genocide against the Uyghurs, concentration camps in China, the saber rattling in Taiwan, the constant theft of American intellectual property, frankly, the production of the base materials for fentanyl in China, then shipped to Mexico and packaged up by drug lords and into the United States, is something that ought to concern us all. And we're also beginning finally a hearing on the origins of COVID. We finally had the Energy Department, one of our folks that looks at these type of issues, come out and say that they thought that COVID had actually begun with a leak in labs in Wuhan that were focused on coronavirus. There's a lot of questions about that. My Democratic friends didn't do anything to hold a single hearing about that when they were in the majority. We're going to get to the bottom of this, because if indeed there was a leak out of the Wuhan labs, which I suspect there was, China ought to pay because it didn't immediately let the world know what was happening. It didn't let the rest of the world take mitigation efforts. It kept things secret and quite frankly engaged in pretty outrageous activity in terms of cornering the market on personal protection equipment, or PPE as it's known, to the detriment of other people that needed supplies when they were dealing with COVID. So a lot of investigation, other investigations also beginning on misuse of the FBI. We'll see if the concerns that many people have voiced, have legs. Again, I suspect they do, but that's what you have an investigation for, and I'm quite certain there'll be a robust effort in that regard. Probably for me personally, the big activities will be, again, focused on, number one, the Appropriations Committee, making sure government is appropriately funded. We spend less but get better value for the money. I have a new position on the Appropriations Committee. In addition to being the vice chairman of the full committee, I'm the chairman of the subcommittee that focuses on transportation, housing, and urban development. A huge jurisdiction of about $90 billion. And of course has a lot to do with the construction of road, rail, water, port facilities, all kinds of infrastructure in the United States, as well as public housing across the country and in rural America, as well as urban America. So we're digging into that, seeing if we can stretch those dollars further, and honestly, if there are savings to be had, achieve those savings. So Congress is up, operational, moving, I think tackling the real problems of the American public. But there'll be a lot of contention about this. It's a Republican House, very narrow majority, but a Democratic Senate, also with a narrow majority. And obviously the president has a vote, so to speak. He has a voice. Nothing becomes law unless he signs it or is overridden, and he's unlikely to be overridden if he were to cast a veto, by a Congress that his party controls one house in and has a very substantial minority in the House of Representatives. So there's going to be a lot of give and take, but again, I hope we can find areas like Ukraine, like the what will be generational struggle against or with China, hopefully peaceful contest, and like Farm Bill, which needs to get written this year, that we can find some common ground on. We can get things done when we work together. But the reality is Democrats have not had to work with Republicans very often in the last 2 years. They control both the House and the Senate. They engaged in a lot of reckless spending. We're all paying for it now with record inflation, and we'll see some more inflation numbers next week. But right now it's running around 6.5%, when the target for inflation is 2%. So again, very uncertain economic time. But we'll be visiting with you about the goings on. Again, I expect a much fuller report, much more substantive legislation reaching the floor in the weeks ahead on things like energy, like the economy, and certainly ultimately like funding the military. And so we're going to be involved in those issues. We'll keep you posted. Thanks for taking the time to listen, and I look forward to visiting with you again next week.